In this seventh video on my series on human dignity, I want to talk about an issue that is really important to me and close to my heart. And that is how our infinite human dignity also means that I have the right not to be spiritually abused and spiritually coerced. The presence of spiritual abuse in the church is a problem the church has always had and continues to have. And it has caused and continues to cause grave scandal within the body of Christ. It is a place where reform is desperately needed. First, I want to briefly define what spiritual abuse is. So, at its heart, spiritual abuse is the use of spiritual authority. So, this can be someone in a position of spiritual authority, or this can be someone invoking a spiritual authority, like Scripture or church's teaching. So, it's the use of spiritual authority to coerce or control somebody else. It is the use of spiritual authority to try and get somebody to believe a certain thing, feel a certain way, or behave a certain way, rather than using spiritual authority to encourage, teach, and invite. As soon as I start using my spiritual authority to try and get someone to believe or behave or feel a certain way, I've now moved into the realm of coercion. Spiritual abuse is a form of psychological abuse, and it can negatively impact someone as much or more than physical abuse. The research is explicitly clear about this. The harm caused by spiritual abuse can impact a person's social and existential dignity. So again, referring back to the Doctrine Office's document on the infinite human dignity of every person, social dignity refers to the material needs someone needs to live a dignified life, and then existential dignity refers to the psychological and spiritual needs that someone has to live a dignified life. Trauma can impact both of those in a significant way and can severely impair someone in basic functioning, in flourishing, in having meaningful relationships. The ontological and infinite dignity of every single human person is precisely what calls the human community, calls the church, calls you and me to not just offer support to people who have been coerced and abused in the church, but to actively work for reform and to keep our communities safe from all types of spiritual coercion. Make a couple more notes on spiritual abuse. It's often thought that spiritual abuse really only happens in cults. And spiritual abuse does happen in cults. However, it doesn't just happen in cults. It is a widespread problem across the church. A 2014 survey done in the UK, conducted by Dr. Lisa Oakley, surveyed Christians, people who identified as Christian in the United Kingdom. And that survey found that 75% of people who identify as Christians in the UK experienced harm in their religious communities due to coercion, manipulation, or the abuse of power. 75%, 3/4. And those are people who still identified as Christian, who hadn't left, who hadn't deconstructed at that point. This is an endemic problem across the church. Any member of a religious community can perpetrate spiritual abuse against another. It doesn't just happen from clerics. Anyone, regardless of their role and their position, if they have spiritual authority over another, there's a risk of spiritual abuse happening. And anecdotally, I would say spiritual abuse probably most often happens within family systems, the misusing of the spiritual authority that parents have over their children. Another point here is that spiritual abuse can and often does happen in conjunction with other forms of abuse. Any type of abuse, financial, sexual, physical abuse, done by a person in a position of spiritual authority is also spiritual abuse. However, spiritual abuse doesn't need to happen with another form of abuse. It can and often does happen on its own. Another really important point here is that spiritual abusers rarely intend to harm others. Now, some do, and I want to comment on that. Some do. And some of the more horrific stories out there about spiritual abuse in the church are people like Jean Vignier or Father Marco Rupnik, who use their spiritual authority in an intentional and malicious way to groom vulnerable people, to groom people under their care for sexual abuse. So spiritual abuse can and does happen in a very intentional and malicious way. But most often it doesn't. Most spiritual abuse happens by people who have the best of intentions. This means good intentions are not sufficient. In pastoral relationships, and whether that's between a religious superior and someone in their community, a spiritual director and the person they're directing, a pastor and a parishioner, a youth minister and a high school student, any type of pastoral relationship, there's inherent vulnerability in that relationship. Even if the person I'm ministering to is wealthier than me, larger than me, stronger than me, older than me, doesn't matter. There's an imbalance of power, and the person being ministered to is the one who is vulnerable. This is widely understood within other helping professions. So like in the mental health field, in the counseling field where I am, for example, no matter how egalitarian I try and make my counseling relationship with clients, I recognize that I'm always in a position of power, that my client is always vulnerable, and therefore I have the responsibility as the person in the position of power to do no harm, even unintentional harm. Then there's a key principle here, right? I call it Spider-Man ethics. With great power comes great responsibility. If I have power in a situation, therefore I have responsibility. And my responsibility is precisely to do no harm, to respect the dignity, the infinite dignity of the person in front of me. The church recognizes this. In a marvelous document that came out in 2020, the Directory for Catechesis, this is a document that outlines the ministry of catechist, the role of catechist, the formation of catechist. In a section talking about the formation and ministry of catechists, it says this, and again, it's talking specifically about catechists, but I believe this can and does apply to anyone in a position of spiritual authority in the church. The Directory for Catechesis says this: the catechist, on account of his service, holds a position relative to the people he accompanies in the faith and is perceived by them as a point of reference, who exercises a certain form of authority. It therefore becomes necessary that this role be lived out with the most absolute respect for the conscience and person of the other, avoiding every kind of abuse, whether of power, of conscience, financial, or sexual. Catechists, in their programs of formation and through an honest dialogue with their spiritual guides, should be helped to identify the correct ways of living out their authority solely as service of their brothers. Moreover, in order not to betray the trust of the persons assigned to them, they should be able to distinguish between the external forum and the internal forum, and should learn to have great respect for the sacred freedom of the other without violating or manipulating this in any way. Here's the key principles in here. It's the recognition that catechists, and again, anyone in a position of spiritual authority, actually has authority, that there is a power imbalance in the first place. And it isn't just recognizing that power imbalance, and actually I want to pause there. In my experience, talking both about lay ministers in the church as well as clerics, it is the exception in my experience and not the rule that there's even a recognition that there's a power imbalance in the first place. Most priests I encounter don't even have a recognition of the power that they have over the people who they serve. So this first principle in this document, the Directory of Catechesis, is that we must recognize that there's a power imbalance in the first place. The second principle is that we must embrace the responsibility that comes from that power imbalance. The responsibility, first and foremost, they have to have the most absolute respect for the conscience and person and freedom of the other. This requires, as this passage said, constant self-reflection, self-awareness, and ongoing accountability and mentorship to make sure that I am not misusing my power and harming others, even unintentionally. A point that's important here, knowing that most spiritual abuse happens unintentionally with the best of intentions. Like, what are the intentions? The intentions are often to help someone else live a more moral life, to help make society more just, to help them towards salvation. However, the church is clear that respecting the dignity of every human person is even more important than spreading the gospel. In a marvelous passage from Vatican II, in the Dignitatis Humanae, the Council Fathers said this: "In spreading religious faith and in introducing religious practices, everyone ought, at all times, to refrain from any manner of action which might seem to carry a hint of coercion, or of a kind of persuasion that would be dishonorable or unworthy, especially when dealing with poor or uneducated people. Such a manner of action would have to be considered an abuse of one's right and a violation of the rights of others." Notice the language here. In spreading the faith, everyone ought, at all times, to refrain from any manner of action which might seem to carry a hint of coercion. Not just isn't coercive, but that even smells like coercion. It must be avoided, because if it's not, this is a violation of other people's rights and dignity. That document goes on to say this: "In the life of the people of God, as it's made its pilgrim way through human history, there has at times appeared a way of acting that was hardly in accord with the spirit of the gospel, or even opposed to it. Nevertheless, the doctrine of the Church that no one is to be coerced in the faith has always stood firm." Here we see the Council acknowledging that there have been times when the Church itself has failed and has prioritized evangelization, has prioritized spreading the gospel, has prioritized spreading Christian culture above the infinite dignity of every human person. And this document acknowledges that the Church was wrong when it did that. Picking up on this theme, though not referencing that document directly, a handful of years ago, Pope Francis visited Canada. He made an apostolic visit to Canada. And the purpose of that visit was precisely to meet with Indigenous communities and apologize for the Catholic Church's role in the horrendous abuses that happened at the Catholic boarding schools in Canada. In one of his addresses on that trip, Pope Francis said this: "Indeed, it may seem easier to force God on people rather than letting them draw near to God. This is contradictory and never works, because that is not how the Lord operates. He does not force us. He does not suppress or overwhelm. Instead, he loves, he liberates, he leaves us free. He does not sustain with his Spirit those who dominate others, who confuse the gospel of our reconciliation with proselytism. One cannot proclaim God in a way contrary to God himself. And yet how many times has this happened in history? While God presents himself simply and quietly, we always have the temptation to impose him and to impose ourselves in his name." Pope Francis is recognizing that it is a constant temptation by Christians, by the Church, to impose God in a way contrary to God himself. And that in doing this, we are distorting God's face, and we are pushing our own agenda rather than the gospel. In the very first video in this series, I referenced a line from Vatican II, from Gaudium et Spes, where it says that human beings are the only creatures on earth which God willed for its own sake. Human beings are ends in and of themselves and can never be used as means to an end, because there is no greater end. That's what this passage is saying. States, economies, organizations, institutions, the Church must serve the dignity of human beings and not the other way around. We cannot crack a few eggs to make an omelet. Human beings can never be used as means to an end. The Church has and continues to fail in this regard. So often, the Church, not historically, yes, historically, but not only historically, today, prioritizes self-protection over the infinite dignity of every single human being, and chooses a preferential option for the institution rather than prioritizing the needs of the vulnerable. One way in which we saw this happen was the same bishops at Vatican II who voted on and approved of that line from Gaudium et Spes. So many of them went back to their own dioceses around the world, and in the years and decades to follow, chose self-protection and the Church's reputation in protecting predator priests over vulnerable children. It chose to cover up and deny and skirt responsibility rather than owning up to the ways it failed. and in the ways people were horrifically abused. This is ongoing. This is a constant problem in the church, and one that desperately needs reform. In a recent passage from Pope Leo, this was back in January of 2026, in an address, Pope Leo was warning against certain forms of ministry activity that can violate human dignity. And in this warning, I think he presents a really helpful, practical criteria for discernment for myself, for each one of us, to help discern when someone is misusing their spiritual authority so that I can better safeguard my own dignity against spiritual abuse. So in this address from Pope Leo, he reminds everyone that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And then he goes on and he says this. And for context, as of recording this video, this address wasn't officially translated into English, so this is an AI translation from the Italian. Pope Leo said this: "Therefore, the proclamation of the gospel, catechesis, and various forms of pastoral action must always be free from forms of coercion, rigidity, and moralism, so ensuring that they do not arouse guilt and fear instead of interior liberation." So here we have in this a spiritual principle to help us discern if a message from a spiritual authority is coming from God or if it's spiritual coercion. If it's something for me to hang on to and deeply discern and take seriously, or something I can immediately let go of, or even report if necessary. We can ask ourselves, does this homily I'm sitting through, does this discussion with a priest in confession, does this speaker at a youth conference, does this YouTube apologist, does this online monologue from a celebrity exorcist, does this lecture about faith from a family member, does it engender in me more interior freedom, or does it cause fear and shame? If it's causing fear and shame, Pope Leo is saying it's probably not coming from the Lord. So if in these moments I'm able to step back for a second and just observe what feelings these messages are bringing up in me, this can be an extremely helpful tool to help protect my own dignity, the dignity of people I'm caring for, of people around me, to avoid being spiritually abused, and help me to grow in a free and beautiful and good relationship with God, rather than a relationship mishaped by coercion and abuse.